Was easy lit a spark. I was living in a dark cave, as long as war, as dank and sick as sanctions. We were living in the dark. We were hungry as invasions. We'd forgotten what hope even tasted like, crouching low and deep as fear. And it started long before I was born, and looked to go on and on beyond my death, and to swallow up our lives and our children's in exile. We were living in the dark. Azizi said enough, half existing, and stood up, not for Tunisia or some pan-Arab nation, or for me, or liberation, for himself, his human self, in despair of a life worthy of a human being. But Azizi lit a spark, and he had some kerosene, and the spark lit a spark, and he set us all on fire. We can see horizons now. One dictatorship has cracked, and the border closed by fear ain't a border anymore, and the lights on modems dance as the keys on keyboards fly, as our fingers reconnect human beings to human rights. And it isn't over yet. It's an avalanche begun, danger falling through the air, and the rubble's full of rocks, and the road is full of snakes. But I know now what you can do, and I know what I can too, and there ain't no going back. The Fallen Protesters Song. And this is dedicated to Riyad Matar, died September 9, 2011, whose name means deliverance rain. These last few days were the most beautiful I ever lived, my friends. For the first time in our lives spent under martial law, we took the secret freedom we'd been eating out of the hidden cupboard and ate it openly. Then we took it right outside like melting ice cream and started giving it away to anyone. After that, we were free. I don't know how to explain it to those who haven't tasted it. Imagine an entire country with a calcium deficiency, long-term, and everybody shrinks, but no one notices. People smelled the free on us like wind on a horse, and loved us and gave us secret bits of their food wrapped in warm bread, beginning to free themselves so that one day the inside and the outside of people would no longer be split, bloody, trembling down the middle, like I was by the bullet spray of soldiers sent to shoot us, then by the state's torture doctors. They cut my insides out, trying to find the freedom and extract it surgically. That's what they do, those who have lost half their humanity. They try to make half-humans out of everyone. My friends, you are heaving a giant iron shelf off the limbs of people whose bones it crushes. Soon it will yield to the weight of all your shoulders. Remember me when that happens. We worked for it together. You were as ready to die for it as I was, but it happened to be me. So when you write a word on a wall for all to see, and it doesn't have to be in code, and no one breaks the hand that wrote it, when freedom is no longer treated like a narcotic, dosed in hidden little baggies only for the few, but becomes like photosynthesis in plants, processing light in every leaf, when everyone can be openly free, when freedom falls like a deliverance rain, then, my friends, remember me. This is a poem after Wilfred Owen, who wrote the famous Dulce et Decorum Est about World War I. Before our helpless sight, they plunge, guttering gourd and ecstasy of rounds behind them, bloodshot, eye-gouged, limping lame, through neighborhoods we recognize and love, shuddering bodies, children, and the grown, who look at us while being cooked alive. Where will we go with all this pain and death, all this blood in such a small country? The smell soaks through the blanket of the earth and brings rats and larger predators. Will any soft spot of green be left in it? where orphan, childless amputees can drag their bright pink stumps to sit and ponder the magnificence of victory. And what is the half-life of such pain? Or will our children's children be diseased if now we are unbandaging the wounds of 50 years sadistic tyranny and reeling from the rot gangrened beneath? When 10 were slaughtered every afternoon who marched in peace, we keened and raged in grief. Only weapons could protect their lives. Now 100 daily die and no relief. Now bombs blow up from ground and down from sky, pinning cities to the wall like beetles, and we beg for heavier arms. If we only had more guns and more explosives, we could keel-haul the country into freedom. War is the only way, our father's way before us, and what other way is there? Beside the only God, what other God? Paint the dead in glory and deny that self-defense did not defend. Say, history has always been this way, or freedom isn't free and must be paid. Point to the sun and say it clearly moves around the earth, and call that common sense and mock, abandon, burn your Galileos. But if you hear the blood at every jolt, gurgle up from crumpled lungs beneath the obscene fall of your neighborhood's cement, and see the eye whites writhing in the heads of a people being boiled alive, my friend, then do not beat those drums of martyrdom. Do not repeat the old and tired lies that war is the only path that leads to freedom, that violence can bring justice to the land, that anything but this is vile betrayal. Two specific nonviolent campaigns conducted by Syrian women, the Stop the Killing campaign and the Brides of Peace campaign. The Stop the Killing campaign was some 25 or 26 events over 4 months. The Brides of Freedom March was a one-time event. I would like to try to begin to assess these campaigns and their meaning in the larger context of the Syrian Revolution. So this is a smattering of some of the different events of the Stop the Killing campaign.
Is that 2011 or 12? Yeah. 12?
In City Mall, Kafrsuse, April 11, Soufana Bakle, a Christian, and 3 of her friends were arrested for that street theater. This is in Duma. May 24, all of them are 2012.
Okay.
The highly conservative suburb of Duma. We've also seen one in Sweda, a mainly Druze area. This is in a Kurdish area. This is a photo collage from one that happened by 4 young women in Damascus who went out in cute little outfits and passed out these notes that said, the country is big enough to fit all of us, stop the killing. This one's in Aleppo, and this is the author of the campaign, Rima Dali, who is of the Alawite sect.
Indeed. Bazaar of Damascus.
For the sake of humanity in Syria, civilian society declares stop all military operations in Syria, 100% Syria. The sign on the left, we're tired, we're tired. We want to live, another solution, 100% Syria. Sign on the right, Syria is for all of us, 100% Syria. Now here they are getting detained. Think about the camera angle. Who's behind the camera?
Because it's in a hand, like lowered, and yeah, it's very discreetly being shot discreetly.
He followed them as long as he could, and they are led away to 49 days of detention. Here are the 4 young women, Rima Dali, Kinda Zaur, and her sister Lubna of Sweda, Ru'a Jafar. Immediately art. Within hours, there was art and solidarity posters. The first 2 were within hours.
Okay.
I don't know if you all caught the very beginning. The April 8th solo stand by Rima Dali. She stands in the middle of Damascus, a busy Damascus street, in front of Parliament, holding the sign, which her signature sign, which became the name for the whole movement, which she's portrayed in the last photo, you know, standing beside, which says, "Stop the killing. We want to build a country for all Syrians." When the security guard accosted her to detain her on that street, they immediately demanded of her, "Which side are you on?" She refused to answer. She said only, "I am Syrian," which in Arabic, all of such nouns would be gendered. So also what she was saying is, "I am a Syrian woman." Because she was saying in Arabic, "Ana Suriye," and that's all she would say. She wouldn't say, "Are you on the revolution side, the regime side?" All the Stop the Killing events ensued, holding banners similar to the original red and white banner. And they were deliberately chosen for neutrality. When the revolution began, I have a few of these old headbands, old wristbands that actually have what we now consider the flag of the regime on it. Initially, the revolution claimed the regime, the same regime flag with the red stripe on top, as their own.
All our pictures from early on, like in the demonstrations, are the red
people say,
flag.
hey, people who entered the revolution later say, hey, why are you with the regime flag? But they don't know that in the beginning, that was a reclaiming. And even like a reclaiming of the national anthem. People were singing it at protests and stuff to say, we are the patriotic Syrians for revolting. But as the revolution emerged, somewhere along the line, this got adopted, and it also helped put an end to Assad using protest footage to claim it was support of regime footage. And this was the flag during the resistance to French colonialism. But much later, another year and a half later, when the Islamists entered the picture, the hardcore Islamists, beyond the Muslim Brotherhood Islamist, when the Nusra and the ISIS and so on entered, they come in with a black flag with a credo of Islam written in calligraphy on it, or a medieval stamp of the Prophet, which it has very crude aesthetic value, stamped on it. It's just black and white. After that, this then became not only the flag of resistance to the regime, but also the flag, those who fly this are with that original secular revolution, the values of democratic human rights against the black flag as well as the red-topped flag. So the symbolism avoided all of that and used red and white as neutral colors to maintain that same neutrality that Rima's answer to the security man, "I am Syrian," maintained. Rima did not act alone on April 8th any more than Rosa Parks acted alone when she refused to get up. The Stop the Killing campaign was an outgrowth of the initial population of the grassroots, that non-violent, youthful, diverse, geographically widespread civilian population that began the revolution in Syria and dominated its non-violent phase. So, but in phase 3 of the revolution, when elements intolerant of religious pluralism became to be on the rise in armed sectors of these revolution, when that had begun happening, both these campaigns had a strong presence of minority members. They were, in fact, initiated by women and by minority members, at a time when that was completely against the general trend of the revolution. So that is something that they are very remarkable for. Women of Sueda made a strong showing. That is the southern region in Syria that is historically home to Syria's Druze population. All 4 members of that one-time event of the March of Freedom were members of minority religious community, all 4 of them. Rima herself being Alawite, 2 sisters from Sueda who were Druze, and the youngest bride, Ru'a, was Shia, was from Salamiya, historically home to most Ismaili, historically the home of a lot of Ismaili Shia in Syria's population. So the 4 women dressed in white wedding gowns enter the busy marketplace in the heart of Damascus on noon, November 21, 2012. Again, to ululations and clapping while being filmed by their associate. They unfurl their banners, also red and white, showing some thematic continuity from the first movement. only to be accosted by security agents and carted away to be imprisoned for 49 days. The Stop the Killing movement actions also, the one that showed the girl in the street throwing the flowers as she crossed the street, she and her brother, both Alawite, were imprisoned for 2 months from that. Soufana Bakle, so you see a lot of minority participation. Soufana Bakle in the mall one, a Christian, also imprisoned with her friends, all 4 of them were imprisoned for that. So I asked you to note the camera angle during the Brides of Freedom March, right? Within hours, I think within 2 hours, one of the officers of the Syrian nonviolence movement, Ala Zaza, sent me the links to the videos. Syrian nonviolence movement, which is something that Afra and I are both members in, started inside Syria by hundreds of members of that were all nonviolent protesters. It was started in April 2011, and it's part of a consortium that then formed by the end of September 2011, called Freedom Days, which was an attempt to create communication between the dozens of civilian groups that had remained nonviolent in an increasingly militarized revolution.
More than a dozen. I think they were about 16.
30 at last count. Now they're doing a recount to try to see who's groups often duck under when all their half their members get arrested, then they come up under a new name with a new rubric and new organization. So what does that tell you? The fact that it was available on YouTube within 2 hours of its occurring. Right, is that it is connected to this network and that it was planned by this network of people, though its participants were only those 4 women, they were not 4 women marching alone. Right, evaluating, assessing the costs and benefits, or the costs and gains of these actions. No one was ever killed at a Stop the Killing protest event. Though, Assad and his troops were not averse to shooting unarmed protesters. The prospect of imprisonment, which their participants were willing to face. I mean, that was the cost that was to be paid. They incurred a lower cost yet on passive yet supportive participants. So there are the participants there, also in the crowd, also part of the support system, who cheered and ululated. And then none of those got arrested, even though that passive support in itself, in the presence of the threat of arrest, is, as you can see by the choice of other bystanders, a high enough cost for many Syrians as to be prohibited. Their actions managed to focus, during the time that those actions continued, an amount of publicity on the regime's brutality, which was being well hidden and well spun by the regime's media spin doctors under the highly legible violence of the armed resistance, which was giving the regime a legitimacy boost to its narrative that from the start it was battling armed gangs. These events forced the regime, however briefly, into a defensive posture. The cost to the regime, I mean, some people, and I would like to hear your input, although it may be a moot point by now, but would going limp in addition when they came to be arrested? Would that have been something that would increase that cost to the regime? The 2 events differ in respect to gender specificity. The Stop the Killing campaign, though initiated and led by women, is not gender specific. In its setup, the Brides of Freedom March, in contrast, capitalizes on gender roles. It turns the white-dressed bride, paradoxically, into an icon of powerful protest, and in doing so, disarms its would-be opponents on the regime side as well as among onlookers. It is clever, knowing its audience in its street theater. Who doesn't love looking at a bride? Not to essentialize here, but I think it would take an act of will for a Syrian woman not to ululate in the gazing upon a bride in her white gown, and that is something that crosses over among women of all religions and sects in Syria. Ironically, however, by not being gender specific, but by being nonviolent in a time that was against the tide of the rising militarization, by using red and white neutral colors, and by restrained neutral language, no, the people want to follow the regime, no curses upon Assad, and so on. Most importantly, by calling for an end to all violence. So think about that, and who might read that in different sides are going to read that in in different ways. The Stop the Killing campaign earned itself a reputation as girly and was brushed aside in the increasingly militarized atmosphere of the revolution in Syria. Some revolution activists were outright hostile towards Stop the Killing, like the Mullis brothers, young filmmakers, who were very cool and hip in the revolution, civilian themselves. They held up a sign at one point saying, "Stop the soap opera." You know, it deliberately echoing the Stop the Killing. Stop the girls' soap opera, actually. By frankly embracing seemingly traditional gender specificity, even though they were slyly turning it into something quite different than traditionally patriarchally conceived views of brides, the Brides of Freedom March dodged that bullet of being dismissed in the same way. You know, one could say, well, both campaigns failed. Well, hey, they didn't bring down the regime, did they? Neither did the armed revolution. The armed resistance did not bring down the regime. It failed abysmally with a huge human cost. And that is to set a bar that is clearly unfair. While they were both acts from revolution youth who ultimately want the transition away from this regime and the rise of the pluralistic democratic state in Syria, obviously no one, including their designers, expected these specific actions by themselves to simply up and bring down the regime. But these actions succeeded at what they strategically aimed to do: lodge an era of doubt into the hearts of regime supporters and pull in the sympathies of the apathetic grays, as they were called, the neutrals, and to neutralize, to make a sudden moment of silence. These, for the most part, they were silent protests, except for the onlookers' cheers, but the protesters themselves were silent, in good Quaker tradition. A moment that would make both sides think about the cost of the armed struggle. Okay, so as you're probably all very familiar with here, armed resistance usually takes away the empowerment of the ordinary person that this revolution is all about. Takes away their ability to participate unless they are willing and able to bear arms. So civilians unable or unwilling to bear arms become passive spectators, and we also know how that marginalizes women in a revolution. These two actions initiated by Syrian women are all the more remarkable for occurring not in that first nonviolent phase of the revolution, but not in the second mixed phase of the revolution, where there was still strong nonviolent civil activism and protest and organizing. Some of the organizing heights were reached in that second phase, from September to December 2011. But in that third phase, when after January 2012, when militarization had become entrenched and was rampant, and there were battles raging, that's when the Battle of Homs happens in February, for weeks, and the city's becoming a charged zone. There's no more venues almost in many places for nonviolent street protests. It is in that phase, April 2012, so working uphill against all of those things, marginalization of women, entrenched militarization of the struggle, marginalization of minorities, rising sectarianism. Against all of those uphill, you have a minority-led, women-led, nonviolent action, one that took off for 4 months. And then again in November, toward the end of that year, another spectacle street theater event highlighting all of those issues against the tide of the revolution. During the first 5 months of nonviolent resistance, mid-March to mid-August 2011, the death toll altogether was 2,019, according to the VDC, a Syrian, local Syrian organization headed by the now forcibly disappeared Razan Zaytouni. Mid-August 2011 to mid-January 2011, the phase of mixed nonviolent and violent resistance, when nonviolent resistance was still quite vibrant, saw the death toll climb to 3,144, a 56% increase. Finally, during the first 5 months, similarly, of armed resistance, mid-January 2012 to mid-June 2012, the death toll was 8,195, a staggering 161% increase in comparison with the casualties during nonviolent struggle. So I say that in response to, well, it didn't succeed. Well, how are we measuring success? This may be a moot point. This is a moot point by now, I realize. We are now in a much later stage of the unfolding saga in Syria than when either of these two actions took place. In the time since the days of these two actions, the escalating violence of the conflict in Syria and the involvement of regional and international agendas and forces and groups has mushroomed to new proportions, to a scale that seems to render hopeless the efficacy of human actions at the individual level and to leave in the dust the consciousness change of human beings from which this revolution began. I hope this is an illusion. Shadow is generally an illusion, though it always claims to be reality and to be immovable when it comes. People power such as that represented by these two actions is what will last, and these women's protests embody it. These highly visible acts of nonviolent resistance may not have brought down the regime, but they are still important. They kept alive, in a phase when it had faded, some sense of the self-empowerment to which Syria's younger generation has awakened. These two protests must be seen as a lineage of as part of a lineage of later acts. They mothered others. They mothered other highly visible acts of nonviolent resistance in Syria. They mothered other acts by women and amplified non-sectarian resistance. The women of Tel's participation in that street theater that you saw the two youths lying on the ground reflecting the shot protesters shot by Assad troops, who despite the conservatism of their town have a clear vision, these young Telli women, of non-religious pluralistic democracy as their goal. And they are also called the girls with green ribbons in later protests, an overlapping group that sort of extends to a later phase because they wear green ribbons and they go around doing stencils on the walls and other actions. These also include the one-woman stand for 2 months, or 2.5 months, of Suad Nofal, a school teacher in Raqqa, the first governorate to be liberated from Assad rule, and then for 3 or 4 heady months, was not under the influence of ISIS, and then ISIS also came to be, Raqqa also came to be the first governorate entirely taken over by the contortion calling itself the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Syrians never use that term for it. We mock it by calling it by its Arabic acronym Daesh, because the words in Arabic are Dawlat al-Iraq Sham, and together they spell Daesh, which clearly shows that its originators never thought this through, and perhaps reveals some of their foreignness. A lot of them are not even from the entire region, and are beheading people whose language they don't even speak.
And the book they most order from Amazon?
Islam for Dummies.
Quran for Dummies.
So Saad Nofal stood against them in a one-woman stand for 2 months after they had been in such power that made it completely too dangerous for a man to do that because he would be shot on sight or beheaded on sight. And she did that from July to October after Father Paolo and Firas al-Hajj Saleh were kidnapped by ISIS in mid-July. Father Paolo, the Italian Jesuit for whom Syria was his adopted land for 30 years. I hope they're both safe. I don't think they are. Neither was Suad acting alone any more than Rima Dali. She was connected to those networks that I believe still exist in Raqqa, that existed for a time of civilian activists. No matter how underground they are, there have to be some of them left. such as Haqquna, such as other groups of civilians that organize to educate people about their democratic and civil rights in Raqqa, even as Islamists were gaining power. Many of them have fled. Jimmy Shahanian is one that I know who's Armenian from Raqqa. Another thing that they did was desecrate the two churches, one of them an Armenian church, Saad Nofel. You could see her in the video of those civilian groups leading them in trying to re-raise the cross that they dashed to the ground, and it was too heavy for them. The stand of Su'ad of Raqqa and many other acts of nonviolent resistance in Syria, to which the women of Stop the Killing gave a predecessor and a model, are still, I wrote this a while ago, and I don't know, are still being birthed in Syria. I hope to God. They are, you see.
Yeah.
I just needed somebody to remind me.
Yeah. That flag.
Terry, the flag was the longest revolution flag made by women of Idlib.
Yes.
A countryside town outside of Idlib. Okay, so Idlib is in the northwest, and it remains, if you look at, like, the BBC has a good sectional map, Idlib remains one of the parts that's this flag, not the black flag, and not the regime flag. So there are, I mean, ISIS really doesn't control very much. And ISIS was never big in Iraq. It had a little tiny corner franchise, and then it blossomed when the Syrian fields opened for it. And then it became a big deal, and that's when it won its little, whatever it did in Iraq when the claims were made that it took the bank in Mosul and so on. Only after it sucked up that, from the Syrian venue. But Idlib remains a place where women are involved in that kind of activism. Underground in the regime-controlled areas also is a place where I shouldn't doubt in that last sentence.
No, don't. Because Damascus is still also under siege.
The women in Damascus, all of the activity they did during the bogus elections, they had, women had this flyer campaign putting, disguised as campaign flyers for Assad, with Assad's picture cleverly on the front. But then when you open it, it shows all of the blood that Assad has shed and the statistics. So facts, just 4 or 5 facts. And they papered really right under the nose of literally, because under the nose of a Hafiz Assad statue, there's them putting one.
Cars right
and
down.
then cars
Damascus.
right in front of government buildings. Mm-hmm.
It's very outrageous.
And speaking of Raqqa, I heard many stories this summer about how
Can you speak up?
about how women are now dominating the underground activism in Raqqa because they're the only group that can conceal their identity under the guise of a male guardian. So they're the ones who can still go in and get reports and mobilize people right under the nose of Daesh.
I want links. I'm glad to hear that.
And also the other thing is that ISIS is not organically supported by the local populations. It's kind of a haphazard phenomena that has come as a result of a power vacuum, and also out of despair, because when people are under shelling and there is a group that's fighting the regime, I mean, it's a hard choice to make for people. So, which is why strategically now, if the United States target ISIS without really doing anything about Assad, it will be creating a much bigger problem in the region, because then it will erode that kind of rejection that is still there among the people, and it would give it more legitimacy if they see the regime as surviving. Just 2 days ago, the UN issued a statement about the amount of crimes that the regime has been committing, and it's still much, much larger than ISIS, despite their kind of grisly crimes and their way of publicizing and spreading
Yeah, not
fear
for
and
lack
terror.
of trying
Yeah.
by ISIS.
Yeah.
Not for lack of trying, but
They're
for their
ugly.
smallness.
But
Yeah.
I mean, the Assad regime has access to state apparatus killing industrial level of kind of destruction. So it's still not comparable. And to tell the Syrian people, I mean, Obama's speech was problematic in that sense for Syrian people because he spoke as if ISIS was the ugliest thing in the region. And for Syrians, that doesn't resonate. Although ISIS is clearly an ugly entity and horrific, it still does not compare to the crimes of the Syrian regime.
But what I didn't understand is under the guise of attacking ISIS, funding is going to the free Syrian. What is going on?
Well, I believe that that's Obama's attempt to address the very point that Ahmad just made, and to say, well, he is also. My problem with that is that it is unilateral, and I feel like we need to. This isn't even on the table anywhere, and it's still, I guess it's in the realm of fantasy, but that massive numbers of UN peacekeeping troops, not UN peacekeeping troops like at Srebrenica. I know that that's immediately where everyone, would go and say, well, they're ineffective. But I feel that, well, okay, I'm not going to say I feel that, but there's a book, I need to look up the title, from Princeton University Press by two experts in that field that talk about those cases, Rwanda, Bosnia, and others, and argue that massive numbers, 250,000 peacekeeping troops, that is what is needed at a crisis of that proportion. They're not talking about Syria, but it applies completely to Syria, and that are under the command of the UN, not of the origin places of the troops, right. Because that was also a problem in Srebrenica. And that would take it away from being a unilateral U.S. act and being embedded in the context of their war in Iraq and so on. But they did come out for Egypt. Okay, so like they did, and just people on a people level, even like Egyptians across the board in diaspora, the guy who was the Google exec who ran immediately to Egypt to help offer his services, the people's solidarity, even in places that themselves were ruled by dictatorships, but especially in like diaspora communities, just people power, organizations, grassroots. People power activates also like NGO resources too, horizontally. They activate them horizontally to aid those young, youthful, horizontal leaderships that grow in Tahrir Square, okay? And that happened in Egypt. Bracketing aside the mess that, I think that, there's things that can still survive from that, but I mean, it did succeed in bringing down that dictator. And nobody expected it, though. Nobody expected it when people amassed in Tahrir. We've had protests before, but something happened that brought, people power can't break down an actual tyrant, an entrenched system. And yet, it did. There weren't superpowers.
But now we see that it didn't. No, it didn't. Because the old regime came back.
Yeah, but they still have hope. But there is something that has moved forward. Nobody there wants to erase that Tahrir. There's been a mobilization there that was a culmination of 3 years of civil resistance work, of course, of much more, but 3 years of really the pressure building from especially from June of 2010 with the We Are All Khalid Saeed movement in solidarity with the young man brutalized and killed by the police in June 2010, culminating in Tahrir Square. And they mobilized something. The Syrian protesters were as many in proportion to Syrian population, but the people in Lebanon didn't, for example, mobilize for them in as large numbers, and that could have made a difference. There are Lebanese analysts who say that, who have been writing that's what would have stopped ISIS, because that's a non-sectarian mobilization.
But don't forget the brutalization of the Lebanese by the Syrian regime for decades, and so the Lebanese are disconnected from being able to resonate with Syrian suffering or with Syrian aspirations.
Egypt is not Syria. People here have a view of Egypt. They have pyramids, they study Egypt in school. Syria is a think of Tiananmen Square as a major people's movement that some of us worked like hell on, in the days of faxes to try and keep going, and Who
In
knows
fact, the
about
Chinese-
Tiananmen Square?
Yeah, in China now, it's even completely denied that it ever happened.
So this is not to be depressing, but I think it's to put it into a context. It's very hard.
But what I wanted to switch with that was simply the end goal being a debate about U.S. military involvement, always coming from the question, why was Syria ignored? You know what I mean? Like I want to switch the gears there to that not being the issue, this U.S.-centric
It's not
issue
all
all
about
the time. You
America.
can sometimes it is possible sometimes, isn't it, to mobilize masses for the UN to do something, or for
U.S. involvement
to address. Not the grassroots initially. There were
maybe
4
not.
no's. They said no to the regime, no to
Initially,
foreign
Mohja.
military. Yes, for
But
the first
later,
4 months.
as the killing
yes,
became brutal,
they're still
and they
remain.
also were inspired by the Libyan model.
Yes.
In fact,
Libya changed
once in
things
Arabic, I
too.
wrote a piece with the title "Thank You, Egypt and Tunisia, but really no." Because I'm translating literally from Arabic. Because what happened is that the speed through which these 2 regimes
Raised
fell,
expectations.
raised expectations incredibly high. And then with the intervention with Libya, when Gaddafi increased his brutality quite suddenly, the Syrians gained the hope that, okay, these 2 regimes fell, and there's intervention in case we fail. There's an international will for democratization. Yeah. So then, although the nonviolent phase was actually achieving results in terms of mobilizing the world community and getting slowly Syria on the map, and also engaging the local populations in involving members from minorities, yet it did not bring the regime down. So the Syrian people felt that they failed, that 6 months and everybody was telling us, like, what is this? You're
And
not
yet,
violent.
in
It's not.
2012, did you notice the 100% Syrian on their signs
Yes.
in November 2012? And that is an underscoring of the non-interventionist folks that are still there and still, maybe out voiced now, but they are still there and they're still inside Syria. And I think more of them are inside Syria than outside Syria. And I think, like, for example, the outside opposition bodies that forum totally didn't hear their voices. But let me just finish that sentence, that for the first at least 4 months, and really, I would say the first and second phase to the end of 2011, there were 3 no's, all under the rubric of the big no to the regime, to distinguish them from the pansy-ass reformist types, reform under the aegis of the regime. And their 3 no's were no to foreign military intervention. That was a big no. It was there. Nobody heard it outside. It was never, told, especially by the left, who claimed they were all CIA proxies. And people had never seen, sat in cafes and had coffee with CIA people. The no to foreign military intervention, no to sectarianism. They were very aware of that from day one. And no to arms, no to violence, in our method of revolution. People who attended, George Sabra, a longtime dissident who then came out at the end of the first year and talked in Paris about having been in Syria and then come out and having been going into these meetings. He wanted to go in and admonish them, now don't bring out things that would play up the sectarian card. And they looked at him, he said, like teenagers looking at their elders, like, we're way ahead of you. And he said, they don't need my advice. They were on top of that. They knew they were committed to non-sectarian, to a concept of Syrian identity that brought everyone together. And he also talked in a personal sense about the kids from his household kind of sneaking out behind his back as if he was going to object, to go to the rallies, and came back all hot and sweaty and feeling the glory of the signs they held up, which had the cross and the crescent together in praise and so on.
So basically, international. Yeah, go ahead.
I think I want to turn something that we've been talking about around. I think the reason that the Syrian situation did not go the way the Egyptians go, because as big and as pyramidal, as important as Egypt is, Syria is a lot more important. I think Syria is what holds the whole region together. And the situation of Syria is not something that there's so many interests.
Yeah.
There's so many people that they know if Syria goes, from the region, from outside the region, from Saudis, from the Gulfies, you know, they're
Iran.
all, Iran, you know, they're all sitting really watching and scared and involved and contributing to this problem. So the reason that it just didn't go nicely, you know, a year of demonstration and it gets resolved is because it is a big issue, and it can't even get resolved like the Egyptians did.
Who knew Crossroads of the Middle East was more than a tourist slogan?
It
Turns out to really be the crux of these regional power balances that no one wants to see change unless they're for their own interest increasing.
Exactly.
Right.
Nobody wants, you know, from the Americans to the Israelis to the Iranians to the Saudis. No, I mean, there is so many books in there.
And let's not forget how the regime, the Syrian regime, the intelligence and the shrewdness of this regime is that the Assad family knew how to play this game. For decades, actually, they created a network of strategic balances. I call it the management of animosities. So they became a convenient enemy, but somewhat reliable animosities. So everybody knew what was happening. They didn't love each other, but it was kind of a crisis management situation.
I was just reading an article that it even surprised me as much as I've read about this stuff. There were agreements. I don't know how much you know about the background of the Iranian stuff. There were agreements between Khomeini when he was in Iraq before the revolution with Assad's father. We're talking 40 years.
They supported the Hama
45
massacre.
years
The
ago.
Iranians supported the Hama massacre.
I mean, they were all connected. They were all playing their dirty cards.
At the expense of the Syrian people.
Exactly.
The thing is, you had a movement of young people whose level of sophistication and then who got wiped out. I mean, they cannot, you know, we've talked about this several times, where you have a leadership that's detained from the nonviolent movement, exiled, enough of it's killed. They never got to that second level of organization around the country. They were getting there, but with Yahya and, you know, that level did not allow, it was like the Green Revolution, you know, just chop it out.
And they were so efficient, the nonviolent formed. And
That's right.
Razan Zaytouna and Yahya Sharbaji
First
had a
3
lot to
months.
do. Yeah, it was happening very fast. And Yahya Sharbaji, if you remember, like the letter he sent us just 2 days before his arrest, he was so optimistic because they were coming up with even a larger
But
structure.
that was the councils. They were coming up with the level of the councils. And I would argue that they did come up with that secondary tier, but maybe not the third step after that. But the first step was the local.
Yeah, explain
What the
about
local
it.
councils
LCC.
are?
Not just, you know, these.
Okay, so the local councils were at the level of neighborhoods, protest committees that were formed by just people who saw each other at protests and began to trust each other enough to meet beforehand to plan the protest. I talked to and interviewed a bunch of protesters, and they said, well, first we really would just go out spontaneously, and we'd see the guys and girls. Sometimes we'd go out and see everybody kind of walking by really quietly because there's too many security out, and sometimes it would be a protest, and then we started meeting beforehand with the ones we trusted to plan them, and then those emerged into
Underground, all
the
organized
local
stuff.
councils. And the LCC was only one of 4 different, okay, so the first level was the local councils, all these separate little neighborhood, very local, just the people you knew, 10 guys and girls you knew in your 2-3 block radius. But then those began to coordinate with the next block and the next town over and so on. And then there was a whole network of at least over, I know the LCC had like 80 in it, and the LCC was just one. Coalitions of councils, so that was the second. That you had the LCC, the Horan coalition in the south part of Syria, and one called the Syrian General Council Coordinating Council with another whole group of councils, maybe a dozen local councils. Then, though, about a year later into the revolution, maybe that was what I think some of the other people who were at those meetings with Yahya, like Seymour, said that what they were talking about was the revolutionary councils. And that was another level of organizing that included not only the youth, but the town leaders who were with the revolution. So, like, merchants, people willing to develop transportation systems, alternate systems, and so they were called the revolutionary councils, not the local coordinating committees, and these then did develop, and there are about 128 of them. I don't know if that number has fluxed up or down a bit. There's an excellent article about that structure and how it was developed by anarchist leftist Omar Aziz, who was killed under torture. They had media departments, education departments, transportation departments, communication departments, and they had a liaison with the then developing FSAs. So they also had a military. They were an attempt to assert civilian control over the emerging local brigades. And that was really important because, yes, the brigades were emerging, they couldn't stop them, but they wanted to assert civilian control over them, like a council, should. Like there should be civilian coordination and control over them. And then a third level would be for that to go national. And that's the part that didn't happen.